So welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writers Center. I am also an author myself. I write fiction primarily, and that's actually how I met tonight's guest, Robert Kerbeck, the author of RUSE. Robert and I met, I believe, in 2015 at the Tin House Writers Workshop. And have interacted at various times over the course of the last few years. So Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Zach. Great to see you. And thank you, Amy. And thank you, Writers Center.
Thanks. So you have a copy of your book handy. And I was wondering if, since no one probably has a copy of the book right now, if you could maybe read a brief excerpt from the book, just so everyone knows a little bit about what we're going to be talking about as we go ahead.
Sure. I'd be happy to. If I told you that you could make millions of dollars and all you had to do was lie on the phone all day to earn it, would you do it? Could you do it? You'd probably start by asking if it was illegal. If so, how illegal? Good for you. You have some kind of conscience. Note that as I flatter you, I'm not answering your question. Or maybe you'd think, shit, what's the harm in finagling some information out of corporations anyway? After all, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, and the like don't care about us. They've shown repeatedly and remorselessly that they're not terribly concerned about bilking consumers or tanking the global economy. Who cares if they get dinged a little? While you're pondering that, I'll point out that the job has some serious perks beyond the money. For one thing, you can ruse from anywhere in the world. Your car, the beach, your bed or basement or backyard surf shack, Monte Carlo, the rainforests of Costa Rica. Over the years, I've rused from London, Paris, the QE2. Those phone calls in the middle of the Atlantic are expensive. Hawaii, even the boardrooms of Wall Street firms while waiting to meet with their CEOs. All you need is a phone. And you can ruse as much or as little as you like. It's up to you. So the job's got flexibility, it'll challenge you, and it pays well. Now for the downside. Not everyone can do what I do. In fact, almost no one can. This is not self-aggrandizement, it's a cold fact. Rusing takes a degree of sophistication and creativity and fortitude and ethical elasticity most people can't summon. But by far the most important trait to make it as a telephone criminal is the gift of gab, the ability to lie and lie again over and over until the lies sound like the truth. If you're as good as I am, the lies sound better than the truth. I admit, as a former professional actor, I have an advantage, but America is full of top-shelf liars who've never taken an improv class or read Stanislavski's An Actor Prepares. You'll also need to be an informed citizen. Knowing what's going on in the world is critical. If I'm calling San Francisco and the 49ers won big the day before, I'm using it. If a firm is under scrutiny for some scandalous fuck-up, their executive was accused of sexual harassment or insider trading, it's me who's off-site with the regulators trying to clean that shit up. If I'm on the phone with the European subsidiary, you better believe I know some local news and a couple of foreign language phrases. Over the years, I've developed proprietary ploys that scored such prized intelligence that my clients believed I was some kind of ninja wraith. And I think it's good always to stop with the ninja because we all like ninjas. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, thank you. First of all, you've got that in your head already. You did that from memory?
No.
Okay.
And I've written a book about rusing, but today is all the truth, nothing but the truth. So an actor friend of mine was reading something from the book at a different event for a different purpose, and he taped the pages up next to his lighting, his camera, his phone. And so I saw him doing that and I said, what a genius idea. And so basically I this actor taught me. And so that's what I did.
I would have taken the lie there. I was so impressed, but I'm still impressed. I'm still impressed with the preparation, but yeah, so that's amazing.
Well, look, again, this is a good thing for writers. One of the things about writers, and I'm a writer now, I'm not an actor, but I was an actor. And I've been to many writers' conferences. That's where I met Zach. And writers are not always the best readers, right? And so if you're a writer and you're going to read on Zoom, rather than have your book and have your head down reading the book, if you can just print out pages and take them up to something, a board, a box, or whatever, now your head is up and we can see you, and we want to see you, and it's just a better, I think, a better way to do it.
That might be the most useful thing we talk about for me today going forward. I'm filing stuff away in my head right now, so we're off to a strong start. But just real quickly, because your background it's a memoir, and your background is important for the memoir. So in your own words, who the heck are you?
Well,
besides a ruser.
Besides a ruser, yeah, exactly. Well, we're living in an era where a lot of people, because of this coronavirus, are looking to pivot, right? We all have to take jobs we don't want to do. We have to do things we don't want to do, and people are looking to pivot, right? And I feel like, if there's anything you want to say about me, man, I've done a lot of pivoting in my life. So I guess I'm a master pivoter.
Okay, I like that. So the first question is the hardest question. I hope you did glance at that one before we went there. What's something that you really wish someone would ask about your writing or your writing practice? And maybe in other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before in terms of being a writer?
Well, this is one of the first events I'm doing because, as you know, the book was delayed because of COVID supply chain issues. So I haven't been asked a whole lot of questions, but, I think one of the things people, I was amazed by, and again, this was outside of writing, somebody was talking about habits, right? How do you get a good habit? How do you change a bad habit into a good habit? And this friend of mine was saying there's this 80% rule, right? So you set a goal and then you lower it so it's only 80% of whatever your goal is, right? So let's say you want to work out 3 times a week. You're like, okay, you know what? I'll do 2 times a week. I'll go for a walk. So you make it really manageable. And when my friend told me this, this was right about when I wanted to start getting back into writing. After many, many years, I was an English major in college, but then I became an actor and went on all these other journeys. And now I've circled back to writing later in life. And that was a really valuable thing because I started to write, and, literally in the beginning, it was 15 minutes a day, and I didn't even, and it wasn't even every day. I think it was 15 minutes. I said, I want to write 15 minutes, 5 days a week. Because it was new, and I had to develop the ability to sit, and so I did that, and then I got it up to half an hour, and and eventually increased it. But even at half an hour, 5 or 6 days a week, it was amazing how much writing I could get done. And so I think for people that have full-time jobs, people that have families, have children, have parents they're taking care of, whatever, the idea that you can't write or you don't have the time to write, I don't think is accurate. I think 15 minutes, half an hour a day, boy, you will get a book done in a shockingly much faster than you would ever have imagined.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my own writing, I've had people be impressed with how hard I work. And I just went to the coffee shop for an hour every morning and sat there and wrote for a while, and sometimes talked to that person instead. So I'm not saying I wasn't working and wasn't doing extra work beyond having a day job, but it never, the 80% really resonated with me because I never felt like I was giving 120% of my effort. It was like, this is a manageable effort that felt accomplishable to me and maintainable. So that's great to know. Speaking of going from working on a project for 15 minutes to getting published, and when we were talking about an event, you did mention an idea of maybe doing a workshop specifically on getting a memoir published. And I thought, since you probably have some good thoughts on that, we're doing a broader conversation, but I definitely wanted to give you a moment to maybe share some thoughts on that. So maybe starting is, what was your publication journey like for this book? How did it go from a doc on your computer assembled 15 minutes, half an hour at a time, to being a published, not quite, but almost published physical copy of the book?
Well, I hope I'm going to turn this into a positive, but everybody hang with me for a moment. So this book was rejected everywhere, right? It was rejected up and down and everybody. And it was really shocking to me because corporate spying is pretty interesting, and a lot of the feedback was very positive about the book and very positive. And yet the book was getting rejected. And it was to a point where my agent said, I'm kind of running out of places to send this book. And I think that's a really, that was a really scary moment, but I'm going to tell you why that ended up being such a blessing, right? And so at that point, I went back and I looked at the book, and I realized, and I had kind of known this, but I had realized that the beginning, until I got into the corporate spying, was too long. There was too much backstory. There was too much stuff on my family. And I took chapter 2 and chapter 3 and combined them into one chapter and basically cut half of it. And from that moment, when we then sent the book out to the 3 editors in the world that were remaining, everybody was all fired up about it. And so it was really fascinating that little thing was preventing people from taking the book. It was just a little slow in the beginning. And so I tell people, I run a writers group, the Malibu Writers Circle, and I hate to say this, don't get mad at me, but shorter is better. I'm sorry to say, but shorter is better. A shorter memoir is better than a longer memoir. You're going to have a better chance of getting published. And I'm very lucky that this one editor, and this is a funny story. So this editor, on this final round where there were the 3 editors in the world that were left, one of the editors wrote a love letter back about the book and still rejected it. But he wrote this love letter back. He's, I love this book. It's right in our wheelhouse, da, 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 da. I really connected to it, but I just don't, And I have a friend who's a publicist, and he's a publicist in the music industry, not in the book industry. And I said, will you do me a favor and call this guy? Because even at that point, I was still cutting some other things down. And I said, will you just call this guy and see if he's willing to have a conversation with me? And because my friend is a fairly famous publicist in the music industry, you can look him up, and he has represented some of the biggest musical acts in the world. The publisher Googled my friend and saw that, and so chatted with my friend, said, yeah, I'll have a call with Robert. And we did a call just like this, me and the publisher. And I told him about some of the changes that I had still been making, cutting more and more things about it. And I could see his eyes light up when I was talking about not having attachment, being collaborative, wanting to work together to get the best possible draft of the book that was going to make readers really, enjoy it and have fun with it. And he offered me the deal right on the call. And so it was pretty amazing to turn a no. So this same person said no, and that's the publisher of the book, Steerforth Press.
Okay, I did not know that, and that's a really fascinating process. And persistence is, whether or not you can get that in front of the same editor, though, persistence is sometimes the biggest name of the publishing game. Is and how arbitrary it is that the person who ended up publishing the book at the first interaction said no. And a no is very often not at all indicative of the quality of a project. It is simply the bandwidth of the person reading the book at the time and their particular mindset and what they have in their catalog and how many books they need to acquire and so many other things that don't relate to the quality of a book at all. So it's publishing's a weird crapshoot, and they pretend like it's a science, but I don't buy it.
Well, and let me give a little segue. So I was a professional actor, and that's part of the book. And I worked a lot as an actor and worked in big roles in TV shows and movies with very famous people. And when I would go in for a final audition, so you'd have your second callback, your third callback, your fourth callback, that performance that you did in that moment was the final performance. It was, so when I would get hired, whatever I did in that final audition was exactly what I did on the set. Nobody was giving me notes. Nobody was directing me. Very rarely would a director say, hey, whatever, And so my point is that when you send your book out to an editor, they want a finished product, right? They want a finished product. And the idea that they're going to fix it and they're going to change the order and they're going to make a suggestion for a new character that should come in, and they're not going to do that. Except I think in rare circumstances. And so I think for your, the audience tonight, I think it's really important that you make sure that when you're submitting that book, that it really is a finished book, right? And that's where the writers group comes in, the Writers Center comes in, the Malibu Writers Circle comes in, where you have a group of people that are looking at this material, and hopefully they're getting published and they've had books published, so they have a good sense of what works and what doesn't work. And so if it's not working, or you're not sure it's working, probably not ready to send out yet, right? Mm-hmm. And so, anyway, so that's just kind of that story of how this book got out there.
That's great. Is there anything you wish you'd known before you started the process, or similarly, anything else you would like, a single tip you'd want to give to someone who was maybe finishing up a project and getting to the publication point, besides make sure it's done?
I think, again, I said this already, I keep it short. I think shorter is better. Go back and look at your book and cut stuff out, because like I said, I almost didn't get this book published because the opening was a little slow. The opening I was overburdening, trying to get too much information in the story. And of course, I see this all the time with writers where, we overburden sentences with extra kind of extraneous details, pretty words. And so that's fine in a sentence. It's fine in 2 sentences. It's fine in a paragraph. It's fine in a page or 2. It's fine in a chapter. But over the course of a book, the extra unnecessary words make your book, instead of 306 pages, 367 pages, right? And that extra length, I think, is often problematic in terms of getting your book out into the world.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
And finally, I think also, once you're a published author, and you're a successful author, and it's your 3rd book or your 6th book, your 7th book, I think some of these rules go by the wayside, right? But I think for these first couple of books, the idea of keeping it tight, I think, is important.
I think there's, I would almost phrase it as, make it easy to publish.
Yeah.
Think of the people, everyone involved, and make it easy for them to do the publishing thing. And that's absolutely a brilliant piece of advice that I don't think gets said nearly enough. So that's not one I've ever heard someone say. It's a little practical sometimes when we're talking of our art, but
right,
no one reads it. It's not really art. It's just a Word doc.
Right. And you look at every other medium for the written word, right? There's a word count, right? If you're a journalist, they're going to tell you it's 800 words for this piece. If you're a playwright, you can't write a 16-hour play. I mean, Tony Kushner did it, but, other than a very rare exceptions, you're going to write a play that's an hour and a half to 2 hours long, right? And the same thing with movies. There's always some sort of time, paradigm involved about how long your piece can be before it's too long.
Yeah, great. So one thing I did want to talk about too, real quickly, was whenever I have anyone on who's come to writing after other career paths, and that's myself included, that's why I like this question, is to address the fact of how sort of everything is writing. Maybe I'll phrase it that way. Like, everything you do contributes to how you end up as a writer. So, just from the book, I know that you've sold cars, you've been a stage and a Hollywood actor, and been a corporate spy, and saying this lovingly, a con man, taking advantage of some people. I say that with the utmost love, because I'm in marketing by day. So, I understand the twisting others to my will is a lot of what my job is. I'm getting people to write, though, so I justify it by working for nonprofits now. But what are there any particular skills, places you recognize now as a published writer, where you look back and go, oh, this is a skill I picked up acting, or this is a skill I picked up on the car lot when I was working at your father's car lot, or you mentioned making these phone calls. One of my worst jobs was working as a college admissions advisor and making like 15 phone calls a day, as well as emails and everything else. And I hated it, but I'm way better at phone calls now. And also, just that skill does translate into off the cuff speaking and being quick with your fingers when you're typing and writing as well. So I'm wondering if you have any of those skills that you find showing up as a writer that came from non-writing things you did earlier in life.
Yeah, well, non-writing, one thing I was going to say writing wise is, for sure, being an actor and reading plays taught me everything I know about writing dialogue, right? And it also, so I really recommend, you were talking about poetry, I'm going to say, go and read some plays, go and read Angels in America, go and read Sam Shepard, Buried Child, go and read Sean O'Casey, Juno and the Paycock, right? Go and read all of these plays, Burn This, Lanford Wilson, right? And you will improve your dialogue just reading those plays. Just like you talked about, you're going to improve your language skills reading poetry, right? And I don't hear people talk, it's interesting, I don't hear plays being talked much about in the world of prose writing. And I kind of felt a little embarrassed when I went to that first Tin House conference, because you guys are all really well read in terms of books. And yes, I was an English major in college, and yes, I read Chaucer and Joyce and whatnot. But then I really went into the world of theater, and I only read plays for 15, 20 years. And Ben Percy, who was our workshop leader and is a wonderful writer, I was kind of embarrassing and kind of making excuses for the fact that I didn't know this novelist and I didn't know that novelist. And he said, I haven't read a play in 20 years. He said, you've read all these plays. You're going to bring something to the table that other people aren't going to bring. And so for all the listeners and viewers right here, you guys all have different artistic experiences. And I think, there are other writers that, they may be musicians. They're going to bring something to the table, right? So don't ever deny, like I was kind of doing that day with Ben Percy, and he was really supportive. Don't ever put down these other skills that you have from other jobs, whether they're artistic or not, because those are the things really that make you successful. They used to say back when I was a young actor that it took 20 years to make a good actor, that you had to have all these life experiences. And I think a lot of that is true for writing. I mean, this memoir is, all of these experiences that I had, and if I didn't have these experiences, I wouldn't have been able to write this book.
I mean, I love the idea of leaning into what you bring. Like, you're going to bring something from your experience and leaning into that. I think improving writing is you lean into that as like your core, then you practice the stuff where maybe you don't have the experience. Yeah, and that's helpful. I mean, there are things you can learn, practical things, but you've got some deep core that's going to make your writing more interesting than anyone else's writing because they don't have those experiences. So that's a great piece of advice, and I'm glad you shared it. There's a question in the chat I did want to go to real quick, and it's not quite a craft question, but it did pop into my head while reading the book too. Were prosecutors interested in your book after it came out? What were the legal implications of publishing this book? Because it could be sort of a confession.
Yes. Yeah. Well, for sure, it's a confession. So the first thing is that, the spying that I did is far enough in the past that it's past the statute of limitations. So knock on wood, they're not going to be coming as we're doing this little craft talk and
that would make for good TV though. That'd make for good TV.
Yeah, we'd see that on YouTube and Twitter. I think that also the time, I kind of lost my train of thought there. Remind me, you were asking.
Were prosecutors interested in your book?
Right. And I think that one thing I did also was I changed the names of the companies in the book, right? So I created companies so that the companies that were hiring me, the companies that I was spying on, are not directly named, because at the end of the day, these are massive companies with armies of attorneys, and they could make my life miserable just because they wanted to make my life miserable, right? So I do talk about real companies in the little bit I read here. I mentioned Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo bilking consumers. Well, we can Google that and find that, right? That's not, but the idea that I'm saying that I was hired to spy by this company or hired to spy by that company, which of course I was, I don't do that in the book. And so that gives me, hopefully a little bit of wiggle room.
Mm-hmm. And then, another question sort of in practical real life considerations, how did you describe your job to friends and family? And I'll say too, I mean, I feel like I sort of knew what you did, not the full depths of it, but I don't feel like you hid those. I don't feel like I was ever deceived. I didn't quite know the depth of what you did, but you were not pretty forthcoming when I first met you, at least in 2015 at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I would just tell people that I was in corporate intelligence. And then if they'd ask me, I'd say, well, if I told you, I'd have to take you out back and kill you. So, and then I would just make a joke and then kind of move on from there. The only ones that I really told, were like close friends, and every close friend I ever had wanted to do this job, begged me to do this job, because everybody wanted a job where you could do from home. Because remember, this is obviously pre-COVID, where now we're all working from home. But back in the day, which of course was not that long ago, everybody wished they could work at home and have a job that was flexible and part-time and yet, paid pretty well. And so all my friends wanted to try to do the job. And so I was like, okay. And they would all come in, and most wouldn't even forget about a day. Most didn't even last an hour. Some, it was literally one phone call. I can't do this. And they were gone. It was really a very rare individual that had the unique, confluence of skills required to do this job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing I did want to mention before going back to the chat window for a couple more questions was a topic that interested me in this book was tone. And it interested me in part because I guess I was there sort of early on when you were getting into writing at the Tin House and writing literary, quote unquote, whatever that means, fiction versus the tone here in your memoir. And I mean, there's certainly things that carry over, and certainly I think hearing you read it out loud, I immediately dialed into your tone a little bit too, in maybe a way that I hadn't been dialing in when I was reading it myself on my laptop. But I did notice I do believe I noticed a different tone in the memoir and in your first book too, which is a little more journalistic than what I found in your fiction. I mean, that's not to compare them in a negative way. I think both tones are excellent. I just found it interesting that this project ended up pulling you to a very consistent tone throughout too. So I'm curious though, how the tone for the book developed. Was it something that, I mean, is this what the book sounded like from the first sentence you typed on your computer when you started this project? Or is this something that maybe evolved as you wrote or was altered maybe significantly during revision?
Well, that's a great question. And when I saw your notes that you sent over about this, I'm not aware of the difference in tone. So I'm interested to hear, what is the difference in tone that you're seeing between that early fiction, those short stories, versus these two nonfiction books?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in your fiction books, I think you're an excellent tugger of emotions in your fiction. And I think the bookends, which I don't want to give away because the bookends in the memoir are fantastic. The beginning and closing does that really strong. There's moments throughout, but perhaps there's a little more of a practical tone in the book. You're talking, much of the book has to detail the logistics of a process as opposed to the emotions felt during those happen, but there's a lot more of the logistics because without understanding the ruse, I can't keep up with the book. Right. So the ruse is sort of, there's an explanatory quality and there's a page turning quality. There's a page turning quality. Like, this is like, I want to know, I mean, the early chapters is like, you're beginning rusing, but you're also, to give away one spoiler here, I'll give away, is like taking Jennifer Lopez to a Dodgers game. So there's like these moments like, what's the next cool thing that's going to happen? It's so the early chapters, it's like I'm at a party with the person with the best party stories ever. And then the later chapters, which we'll get to in a minute, I think, in terms of the pacing. Anyway, that's what I meant by tone. Like it's not as much about delving into interiority as into explaining a process. And I felt like the tone was like, it's very clever, it's very smart, it's very authoritative. And I think maybe it's a little less vulnerable than when you're writing fiction because you're a master of this thing you're describing. So you get that authoritativeness. So that was my mini essay on this book. So if you'd like to read the whole thing.
Well, I was really interested in that. I think, I'm not aware of the difference when I'm writing really anything, because I've written plays and I've had a number of short stories published. I've had a number of essays published, now these books, and I don't know that I go into any of the project thinking anything different other than this is a story I'm inspired to tell, whether I'm making it up and it's fiction or whether it actually happened and it's nonfiction. I'm not quite aware of any of that. I mean, I do think that my writing is maturing because, I'm learning stuff. And then, of course, obviously with nonfiction, you do have to explain, like, my first book was Malibu Burning, which was about this terrible wildfire that we had in 2018 that burned down half of Malibu. Everyone saw it on the news. And, I had to talk about wildfires and explain how they, because a lot of people that don't live in California in these fire areas, they don't know how these fires spread so quickly and how it's 2000-degree heat and how they burn, they create so much havoc and damage. And so, you have to explain that stuff. And so in RUSE, there's a little bit of that, like you pointed out. I've got to explain why this information that I'm getting from these corporations, why it's worth so much money, right? And there's a line in the book, I was LinkedIn before LinkedIn was invented, right? And it was true, because pre-crash 2008, there was no way for major corporations to get the type of intelligence on who worked where, what they did, who were the best people on the team, what were the internal rankings on who were the best people on teams, what the plans of these, all of these things, we've as we've all experienced, there were a lot of things that used to be private that are not private anymore, right? And there's been a wave of changing from non-public to public in terms of our information and everything about us, right? So I think some of that stuff, you've got to explain those things, and that probably does create a little bit of a, like you said, more of an authority kind of explaining that, right?
Yeah, I think maybe it comes down that there's necessarily more exposition, and I think your theater background, where you have in plays you have very little exposition because you have to need things in scenes. So I think you have a knack for scene just from experience. And this writing project in particular required you to delve. Maybe that's the tone difference I'm hearing, is that there's necessary exposition here, where when you're writing a scene, you're such a confident scene writer that maybe that's where it's coming from. So I don't know. I'm going to go back, and when I get my physical copy, I'll trade notes once I've gone through it a couple more times.
That I think I got it now. And that's really important for nonfiction writers. So thank you, because you just made me realize it. It's really important. Like the first draft of the Malibu Burning book and the first draft of RUSE, what they were lacking was a sense of the world, the greater world, during the time that I was writing, right? So for example, Great Recession, we'll just pick that. There's moments in the book where it's set in the Great Recession, when the world economy is crashing, and trillions of dollars are being lost, and people are being fired, companies are going bankrupt, right? And I had to give some historical perspective on that, right? So that everybody kind of understands that. And even if we live through it and we remember it, we get some more oh, wow, I didn't realize it started when Lehman Brothers failed on September 15th. Oh, well, yeah, that's right. I remember. Oh my God, that's right. General Motors almost went under. Oh, I remember they had to bail that. Oh, yeah. I remember, and so you have to give. And so for nonfiction writers out there, I think when you're writing, even if it's your memoir, giving some historical perspective on what was going on in the world, the greater world, the bigger world around you, I think can really kind of blow out your story in a very positive way, right? It can really give some scope. Because if you're just talking about your whatever, your serious health issues that you were going through, or emotional issues that you were going through, but if you can put that in the context of the world, all of a sudden there may be some connections there that are really fascinating, and can kind of give you, kind of like really, like I said, really blow that world out.
That's a nice tip. I like that one too. So back to the chat window for a question. Is your book a how-to on how to ruse?
Well, I think it's as much a how-to on how not to get rused. Right? I mean, we're all getting these phishing calls. We're all getting scamming calls. We're all seeing charges on our credit card, all of these different things. And so, after you read my book, I think you're definitely going to be less susceptible to being scammed or conned.
Yeah. I mean, and speaking of like, is it a how-to? I mean, it's more of a how I could never possibly do this for me when I was reading this. Like, oh gosh, I could never pull this one off. And I mean, again, I think there's definitely marketing operates in some very similar ways to rusing, but it's a lot less direct. I can't quite pull. I don't think I can pull it off. So it is definitely a skill that I wouldn't have. Another question from the chat: what did you enjoy most about writing the book, and what did you like least about writing the book?
I mean, in the book, and again, maybe I'll give a little bit away, but at a certain point, I had to take a real job in corporate America, which I had never done. And it was a real job in corporate America, suit and tie, flying to New York, flying to London, meeting with the top executives at major Wall Street firms and banks. And what was amazing is here I was doing this job where I was lying all the time and getting this information. And now I go into the real world where I'm actually going to be doing senior level executive recruiting. I'm going to be saying who I really am. I'm not going to be lying anymore. It's going to be all above board, and it's going to be legitimate. And what I found shocking was how much lying there was directly to my face in the corporate workspace, and how much politics there was, and people would be lying to me. They knew that they were lying to me. I knew that they were lying to me, and yet they still lied to me, right? And this went on every day, and it was really, disheartening. But of course, in the writing process, it was a lot of fun to go back and to remember all of these crazy shenanigans with the duplicity that, in a weird sort of way, I found even worse in person than I had found when I was on the phone. And I enjoyed writing those chapters. And then in terms of the chapters I enjoyed the least, I think some of the celebrity stuff, because for me, I lived it. I think readers are going to be really interested in it because, it's not just me seeing somebody at a party. It's me really, being, closely connected to someone for sometimes a significant period of time. And so, I don't know. I think there's something about, because I went through that, I didn't really want to tell all of those stories. But they're important because they were part of my life, and they are cool stories. It just, I don't know, the whole idea of name dropping, I didn't want to be name dropping. But at the end of the day, do you want to know about the phone call where Yoko Ono compared me to John Lennon? Yes, you want to know about that phone call, right? Even though I didn't want to necessarily write that phone call, it's an important phone call. It was crazy, and working with O.J. Simpson the week before he murdered 2 people, it's like, I didn't really want to relive that, but it was important. So those weren't quite as much fun.
Yeah, I mean, and the O.J. Simpson chapter, I think it was published separately as a standalone piece at some point, or at least a version of it, right?
A version of it, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's also a very reflective chapter. I mean, that's a very interesting chapter because it's sort of the opposite of name dropping, because you're going into the reflection of your own, I'm not going to say complicity by any means, but you were there shortly before this horrible tragedy, and you have to reflect on what that means to have been in proximity to something so major. So I think that's and that said, I mean, I've known you for a while, and I mean, I know a couple of the stories, but also, like, man, you could just dominate every talk at every chat at every bar. You're so polite not doing that. So your humility wins out. I want to ask one more question I have, though, or one more topic, because you hit on the later chapters where you entered corporate America and lived that. And one thing that was interesting, and you also mentioned in terms of some of the stuff you cut out, you merged and cut things out earlier in the book. And flow of time in the book, I thought, was just really effective. But it also was unusual in that there were sort of 2 distinct flows of time for me. At the beginning, you have larger gaps of time happening between chapters, sometimes within chapters. Like, it's a little more anecdotal storytelling. We're getting moments, representative moments going forward. We get some moments like the celebrity encounters you've mentioned, and we get the beginning of your rusing career in more individual scenes and a few bits of summary going forward. But then we get to the point when you enter corporate America, and we enter almost a more linear timeline at that point. So there's this sort of like rapid flow of time, then time slows down, not in terms of the pace of the action, but in terms of how quickly it is passing on pages. And first, I guess my first question is, was that an intentional thing? Was that a natural outcome of the way the material was? Where some of the new material just fresher in your mind and easier to go into this linear chronological detail, or anyway, just a really effective strategy? Like, there's this fast pace, then there's a different kind of fast pace and a dwelling at the end.
Remind me to talk about records. I have a note I want to give about records that I think people might enjoy. First of all, thank you. That's a great observation. I think it was because first of all, it was natural. It just happened. That's just the way the story was told. And the story came to me. But I also think that there's something about that material because it's more relevant in terms of time, because it's closer to the present, it was really about the transition for me going, what the hell am I doing with my life? Here I started out, I left my father's car business because I felt it was dishonest. I went to New York to be an actor. I did these great plays. I got reviewed in the New Yorker, rave review in the New York Times. I was hanging out with Paul Newman. Well, you know, I went to Los Angeles. I did all of these great TV shows that looked like I was going to have this great career. And then no. And then my acting career kind of really waned, and I started doing bad TV and you know, and there was a certain, you know, and then I kind of went to the dark side and embraced the rusing, which I'd always kind of kept at a distance. And I always thought I was going to, you know, it was just temporary. It was just temporary. You know, I wasn't really getting a lot of money out of it. It was just a survival job. And then all of a sudden, when the acting kind of disappeared, I really embraced the rusing and kind of went over to the dark side and, you know, made money and almost got into big trouble. And then the crash came, and then I had to take this real job. And it was during this course of this real job that kind of the toll of crossing over to the dark side started to really weigh on me. I became quite depressed. You know, I talk about this in the book. I started drinking a lot. And, you know, it was a really difficult, painful time. And so I think the reason I'm slowing down in time there is so you're really getting a sense of kind of my misery and my descent. And what I hope the reader gets out of that is that they see that and they feel that. And then when I kind of turn around and go, wait a second, you know, I'm not going to do this rusing anymore. I'm going to go back to where I started, which was as an English major in college. And I'm going to write this silly little story. And I don't care if anybody reads it, and I don't care if it's any good, but boy, doing it made me really happy, right? And I had so much joy that I wrote a suicide note, and I was not suicidal, even though I was feeling that way. But I wrote a suicide note. That was the first piece of creative writing I had written since college, right? And it was a suicide note, but it was in the guise of a character. And I eventually wrote a book from that suicide note. And I think, you know, Tom Perrotta, and I love this, that I can actually quote a prose writer as opposed to normally I'm just quoting playwrights. Mm-hmm. So I hope you're going to give me credit for that, Zach. Tom Perrotta talks about writers have to have skin in the game, right? And so that suicide note that I wrote, man, did I have skin in that game, right? I was as depressed as I'd ever been. And so that note really registered for me. I believed it. It was true, even though it was fiction, even though it was made up, right? But it was true because it was close to me, right? And, you know, and now tie in my acting background. So I'm a member of the Actor Studio, and the Actor Studio became famous in the 50s because of the technique of people using their own personal experiences as substitutions for what the character was really going through, right? And so that the person would think, remember emotions, objects, feelings, temperature, you know, whatever was going on for them in that real moment, in their real life, they would bring that to the film or to the play, right? And I think it's the same thing in writing. You know, I was feeling really seriously depressed, and the next thing I knew is I created a character who was going to jump off a ship, and then I ended up writing a book from that. And unfortunately, that book wasn't very good, but there was something pure about it. The prose wasn't very good, but the story, the character, the emotions were great. And that was what inspired me to go, okay, well, my writing now needs some help. And that was when I started the writers group, and step by step, you know, began honing the craft of writing.
Yeah, great. That's great. Oh, you said, to remind you to mention about records.
Yeah. So, you know, people, you know, there are probably a lot of people watching tonight that have a memoir. You know, maybe their memoir's finished, maybe they're halfway through, maybe they want to write one. And what I say is, great, do it, please. We need it. You know, whatever, I don't care what anybody else says. We need it. We need your story, but give us the greatest hits. Pretend it's the greatest hits album, right? We don't need to know everything. We don't need to go in chronological order every moment. And maybe that's why there's a lot of time skipping in the beginning, because I'm just kind of going to what is the most fun? What's the most interesting? What's the most painful? What's the most poignant, right? That's what we want. We don't need every little detail, right? And I think, you know, again, in my writers group, I see a lot of memoirs too. And I think that's the the thing that memoirs can get bogged down with is they forget to give the readers a good story, right? It's all true, and a lot of times it's very well written, but we don't need every little detail. We just need the hits.
Yeah, great, thank you. So back to the chat window, and I guess I'll add a part to this question. Is first of all, did you do any rusing during the era of LinkedIn? And if so, did you have to create fake profiles, or there's no need for people to look you up while you interacted with them?
Well, most times what I was doing was I was impersonating someone that existed. So they would have a LinkedIn profile. And so if they looked up, whoever I said I was, they would see that person. And many times I was impersonating executives who, forget about existing, they were actually quite well known. And so, they would feel like, oh my God, I cannot believe I have so-and-so, the CEO of blah, blah, blah on the phone. What do you need? They were, ready, willing, and able to give me anything I needed because I had taken on this persona of this very well-known individual.
Great. Another question from the chat. Could a woman have done what you did in terms of?
Well, thank you for that question, because when I got hired, only women did this job. And the woman who hired me, she had this spying company, and so it was a female-run business, and all her employees were women. She did not believe that a man could do this job. And she hired my buddy, in the book, his name is Pax, and he was the first one that she hired. And then he talked her into hiring me. And then after us, she only hired women for years. And so it's interesting that most of the people that were doing the spying were actually women.
Thank you. So how did the art of the ruse go beyond the skills of acting and selling for you or for anyone?
That's a question?
Yes.
How did they go beyond the skills of acting and selling? Well, look,
what did you have to learn on the job, basically, is maybe how I would ask it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I came from a business family, and I think that was one of the skills, yes, I had the acting gene, and, but I also came from an entrepreneurial family. My great grandfather came over from Armenia and sold horse carriages before cars were invented, and then switched to automobiles because he recognized that was the future, right? So, that kind of, entrepreneurial quality is in the Kerbeckian, now Kerbeck DNA. And so I think that those skills, that business sense in combination with the other things, are really what enabled me to do the job. That's what kind of made me, whatever you want to say, arguably the world's greatest corporate spy. That's what somebody said once in describing me. So
back to the book proper, and one thing so I write fiction. I intentionally write away from myself. When I find myself appearing, I'm not saying, I think all fiction writers, we appear in our own works. I'm not saying I'm not trying to deny that, but I also definitely find myself intentionally writing away from myself, and I don't imagine ever writing a memoir or too much in terms of personal essay. So how do you approach yourself on the page? Are you aiming for 100% honesty about every thought and action, which seems impossible to me, though? So what goal do you set for yourself in terms of portraying yourself on the page?
I think I have to be really honest, and I think if I don't make myself look bad in the book at some points in the book, then I'm really being dishonest, right? I have to, in this book, I had to really reckon with the moral question about what I did, and at one point I have a scene where my child, now I get choked up just thinking about it, where my child's hearing me ruse, and I had to, my kid, I think, was 8 then, and so I had to explain what I was doing, and I tried to rationalize it, and my child wasn't going for any of it, and at the end of it said, "But it's dishonest." And that moment really hit me, because I kind of had lost sight of that, right? And so that's a moment in the book where I think, yeah, you go, and I know you were kind and said you lovingly referred to me as a con man, but yeah, that's true, and it's accurate. And so if I'm not being honest about that, then the book really isn't honest. And you can't write a memoir that's not honest. I'm sorry. And by the way, I read those too, where people are holding back. They don't want to hurt somebody. And I get it. It's really hard, you know. In my book, Madonna is going to be really bummed out when she sees how badly she's treated in this book. And I know for a fact she's going to be calling me about it, right? I'm teasing about that. Madonna makes an appearance because my wife worked for her, and she was, quite frankly, probably the worst human being in the history of the planet. But yeah, you know, you just got to be honest when you write a memoir. It's very difficult, and hopefully, you know, there's going to be times in this book where people are not really happy with me, and they're not really digging me, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't. You know, I'm not proud of what I did then. It's a hell of a great story, and you know, I've learned a lot from it, and changed a great deal. But yeah, you know, I have to basically say, yeah, I was lying and conning people to get information.
I mean, I think a couple things. First of all, I mean, it's very, in the introduction, it's clear you're not withholding, or you're not trying to sell this as a noble pursuit. I think right away you set the tone clearly. So I think that's maybe a lesson there, is like, when you realize there's an important thing for readers to know, make sure it's right at the beginning. Don't withhold that important information from them. I think you do that. And also, though, you mentioned making it enjoyable, and it's enjoyable to follow this. I mean, it is a caper in a way, in, you know, speaking of a film caper, where you're enjoying the process of following along. So it is told in an enjoyable way. And you as a narrator are very sympathetic throughout all this too. So, and there's all kinds of really solid elements working to make this, like, not trying to sugarcoat it, but you're also presenting it in a way is fun and enjoyable to read. So I think what you just said is absolutely true, that it is a good story. It's a very good story. And anyone who reads it is going to, yeah.
Well, you know, most people have never seen the world of corporate spying, right? So we all know the Russians spy on the Chinese spy on us. But the idea that major American corporations are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars a year, to spy on each other, most people don't know that, right? And of course, the corporations that hired me, if we were to, you know, bring them out and call them out in the light, they would all deny it. They would say they have no idea. And boy, if they had known what Robert was doing, they never would have hired him. And that's a lie, because it's going on, you know, to this day, right? And so I think that's something and that's been a lot of the feedback from this, and you know, and that's why, you know, there currently is you know, some pretty wonderful interest in bringing this story to the television screen for a series, because we just have not seen corporate spying, and people are fascinated to kind of go into that world.
I was about to say, is there a screenplay? Because I was definitely screenplaying this. I was thinking a single film. I didn't realize for TV, but I had lots. Just so you know, I was turning this into a Ferris Bueller style narrated. Like, in my head, I have a very clear screenplay of what this would be. Just so you know, if you need it, I'll give you my notes.
Thank you. Yeah. No. So. Yeah, there's a production company that is attached, and they're really wonderful. They have many shows on air. They have many super high quality shows on air, which I really like. And you know, again, this might be cool for you know, your viewers to see and hear. The process is fascinating, because they keep talking about the writer and the writer and the writer, and I'm not the writer. The writer is the showrunner that they bring in, who's an individual who has usually run a show before, and run the show means running the whole, you know, the whole gamut, everything to do with making a TV series. But it also involves them writing a lot of the episodes, and certainly the original episodes, the pilot. And then usually once the story gets going, they write this thing called the Bible, which is basically they map out years and years of the series and where things could go. And then once that Bible's kind of written, then they start offloading some of the episodes to other writers, right? And it was funny, the first couple of calls with the production company and different people, and they were talking about the writer and the writer. I kept wanting to raise my hand, like I'm right here, but that's not what they're talking about. So yeah, so it's been fascinating. You know, so you do all these interviews with really, you know, great, well-known showrunners, and we're down to kind of the final couple of people, you know, that we feel have the best take on the RUSE story. And then what happens is we pick one, and then that one person's going to write a take. They've already kind of written initial takes, but then they write that final take, and then that take gets presented to a studio, and then hopefully that studio says, we love this take, and then you're off to the races, and you start, you know, casting and all of that other stuff, and you have a TV series.
Oh, well, I'm excited for this, so I'll be waiting with I won't say bated breath, because this stuff takes a long time, but I'm eager to see what happens. And we're sort of at the end of our time now, so I did want to move to our final question we like to end on for all our guests, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
Get in a writer's group. Get in a writer's group. I mean, honestly, I would never be published, and I'm telling you, that is the absolute truth. If you saw the first draft of RUSE, I mean, I told you how many times it was rejected. If you saw the first draft of one of my short stories, if you would be, you know, you'd go, you know, you might not say it's terrible, but you wouldn't be jumping up and down about it. You wouldn't expect it to get published or expect it to, you know, whatever. And it's only through the notes of my group, sometimes bringing it, but that's the next thing is I don't just submit, you know, a chapter to my group once. I submit it, I revise it, I submit it again, you know, sometimes 3 times, you know. And I think that's the key to success as a writer, is having people you trust who are reading your work, giving you high quality notes. And that's really, and if you can keep the continuity of the group, that's even more important, because writers get to know your tricks and your strengths and your weaknesses. One of my weaknesses is description, right? I feel I'm really good with dialogue, not so good with description. And a lot of times the people in my group are like, Robert, we need to know this person's hair. We need to know what they look like, right? And I go, oh gosh, I hate writing that stuff, but they're right. You know, I need to do it, you know? So that would be my advice.
Great, that's a great piece of advice. And at least a couple pals. If you can't have a formal writing group, get a couple pals who you can bounce ideas off of and do things with. So Robert, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone who's joined us, please pre-order RUSE. We'll put the link back in the chat window here a little bit before we go. But it's been a great chat. I've learned things. I hope everyone here has learned things. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this book does when it shows up in the world in actual physical real copies.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks, everyone. Good night from the Writers Center.